First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, and the director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. And I want to welcome you today to the colloquium, our colloquium for this spring semester. Before I do, I have one logistic request on your part, and that is please check your cell phones right now and make sure that they're on silent. I have done this before and left my own open, and it's kind of embarrassing, but we're in such a small room it can be disruptive. If you do that for me, please. Secondly, and just like our name, which is the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, we have a number of presentations throughout the year that deal with societal issues. And I want to draw your attention to our next event, which will be presented by Emily Diamond, who is professor at the Wright Institute here in Berkeley. And when she will give a talk entitled, "What Explains the Dramatic Rise in Autism Prevalence from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 68, the hunt for environmental factors." And we will have as a discussant Chancellor Professor Emeritus Troy Duster, who will also comment on the presentation. That will take place March 7th from 4 to 5:30 here in the Vildovsky Room. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, many of whom many in this room who know him, but it's a great pleasure, a colleague of mine, to introduce him. He is the author of numerous articles and a number of books, which I will mention. The Color of Class, The Copper Mines from African Advancement to Zambianization, Manufacturing Consent, Changes in the Labor Process Under Monopoly Capitalism, The Politics of Production, Factory Regimes Under Capitalism and Socialism, The Radiant Past, Ideology and Reality, and Hungary's Road to Capitalism, and the Extended Case Method, 4 centuries, 4 decades, 4 great transformations in one theoretical tradition. These were solely offered. He has many others in which he has been a contributor and been a partner in writing. As you know, the books I mentioned is something in which he's been extremely active in, which is in ethnography and doing ethnographic search in terms of empirical evidence, and he's always been an advocate of taking that empirical work and integrating it into theory. And in that tradition, he's concentrated more recently on the issues of theory. And for our talk today, I want to bring to you 2 papers that are forthcoming. The first is Making Sense of Bourdieu, From Demolition to Recuperation and Critique. And secondly, The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx Meets Bourdieu. And I think they were preambles to the talk he'll give today, which is entitled, and I might add, is the title for his forthcoming book on the subject, Marxism Engages Bourdieu. It's a great pleasure, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Professor Michael Burawoy.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I think it's the first talk I've ever given over here. And it's nice to be introduced by Martin, my old neighbor who then decided to abandon me, old friend and fellow ethnographer. Thank you. Yes, great. So yes, thank you all for coming this Wednesday afternoon. Well, yes, this is what I'm going to talk about. Marxism engages Bourdieu. And what I want to do is say a little bit about the history of this project. And then I will probably talk a little bit about sociology and Marxism, and Bourdieu being a sociologist, as far as I'm concerned, a very, very famous one, the most influential social theorist of our time. And then I want to really talk about Marx, Gramsci, and Bourdieu. That will be the heart of the talk. I know most of you have never seen me use a PowerPoint
We may not yet.
The undergraduates in my class continue to complain ever more intensely about the legibility of my writing, so we'll see how this works. PowerPoints are a lot of fun. We'll see if you agree at the end of this. So yes. So anyway, it is a bit of experiment, but well, we'll see what happens. All right, the history of this project. Well, I actually began this project a long time ago, probably in the 80s, when I was extraordinarily skeptical about the significance of Pierre Bourdieu. And it was only because students kept on pounding, graduate students kept on pounding on my door, demanding that Bourdieu be seen as a major, influential, great, if not grand theorist, that I finally sort of began to think, well, perhaps there's something there. I had read every 2 or 3 years, I would read one of his books. It was very exhausting to read his books, and I never thought there was really anything new there. When I read Outline of a Theory of Praxis, anthropologists had said it all before. When I read Reproduction on Education, the Althusserians had said it all before. When I read Distinction, I thought Gramsci had said it all before, and I was really pissed off with having to read 600 pages and discover Gramsci had said it all before. But those students then, for many years, pounding on board, I eventually caved in and I said, okay, fine, give me a seminar. So 4 students came every week for a semester, and I said, I'm not going to read anything. I have no time to read Bourdieu. It's too exhausting. And they wrote these memos every week. And slowly but surely, I began to realize that actually I had a very narrow vision of the extraordinary scope and magnificence of Bourdieu's theory. And so then I decided, it was about 2005, I had just been liberated from being chair of the department, and I thought I was going to treat myself to something very special. So I asked my colleague Loic Vacon whether he would allow me to enter into his boot camp Bourdieu course, which some of you here will have taken. It's an extraordinary course, I recommend it to all. As Bourdieu always used to consult Loic, this is Loic's story, would consult Loic as to what he had written before. Loic knew Bourdieu better than Bourdieu, and there was no better defender of Bourdieu than Loic Vacon. It was impossible to argue with him. In fact, it was very interesting. I took his course, and every week we would write these memos, and that's where this whole project began. The silent conversation between Bourdieu and Marxism. It was there, I thought it was there, but it was invisible. He didn't write about it. And Loic would every week not every week, but often, he would take my memos that we all had to produce, and he would hold them up to everybody, read them out, and actually humiliate me in public. And graduate students loved it, and I think I loved it too, which made me all the more resolute in pursuing this project. So, after I had taken the course, I realized that this man was extraordinary. His breadth was extraordinary. His depth was extraordinary. And even his writing, though I would read for 15 minutes and then have to take a nap, nevertheless, his sentences were very seductive once one really tried to wrestle with them. That's how it began, and then I began to start publishing and giving lectures in various places on relationship between Bourdieu and Marxism, and I continue to do so, and I'm continually changing my mind about this. Yes, actually, the most recent thing I've written about this is not the one of talk I'm going to give today, though this is a sort of also new, but Martine mentioned making sense of Bourdieu. Finally, I came across a Marxist who was more critical of Bourdieu than me. His name is Dylan Riley, and he wrote a demolition of Bourdieu, and I come to Bourdieu's defense in this thing called Making Sense of Bourdieu. But for the most part, I have been critical, but I believe in having a conversation between theorists, and that's what I'm going to do today. So let me just say a little bit about sociology and Marxism. What really has happened historically, that sociologists have seen Marxism as the enemy and have constituted themselves through a dialogue, a critique of Marxism. But what they really have done, they have basically picked up and destroyed and demolished Marx, and therefore, on the assumption that Marx was hopeless, Marxism built on the shoulders of Marx must also be hopeless, and therefore failed to actually deal with the tradition of Marxism. And that's very true of the great Talcott Parsons, who was the only comparable sociologist with the same vistas as Bourdieu and the same influence across disciplines and across the world as Bourdieu. And so I think that's what Bourdieu does. He has on occasions engaged with Marx, showed how Marx was really a theorist that was limited to the 19th century. He did not have a theory of symbolic domination, and therefore we shouldn't take Marxism seriously. The fact of the matter is that Marxism actually made the same critiques of Marx as Bourdieu makes of Marx. And one can look at the writings of Gramsci, as we will today, Fanon, Beauvoir, Freire, Lukács, Marcuse. I could go down a whole list of Marxists, Western Marxists mainly, who have actually taken the question of cultural domination as the key question, for the understanding of the world around us. So it seems appropriate that one should actually engage in a conversation between Bourdieu and those Marxists that have dealt with the question of cultural domination. Now, I've chosen Gramsci today because I think the conversation between Bourdieu and Gramsci is particularly interesting in that it will reveal what I believe to be the essential elements of Gramsci and of Bourdieu. I could have chosen others, but Gramsci, I guess I'm a bit of a Gramscian, which you will figure out as I talk that I'm a bit biased in these matters. I'll try and keep my bias to within limits. So what is interesting when one thinks about the two, Bourdieu and Gramsci, that their architecture of their theories are quite similar. Bourdieu is known for his concepts of capital, field, and habitus, but behind those concepts, that's what we might call it the superstructure, or perhaps better, the infrastructure of his theory. But behind those concepts are the three legs of Bourdieu's theory. The first leg is a theory of symbolic domination, which for Bourdieu is a form of domination that is not understood as such, that is not recognized as such, that is misrecognized. And masculine domination is, for him, the prototype of symbolic domination. That's the first leg. The second leg, he raises the question, okay, if symbolic domination is so ubiquitous, so how is it that we as sociologists can see through it? And so he approaches the problem of reflexivity very seriously. That's the second point. And the third point, which is really fascinating to me in particular, I suppose, because I've been a sort of evangelist of public sociology, and Bourdieu, is probably the greatest public sociologist. Well, certainly of the last 50 years. There has been no sociologist, when we think about France at any rate, no sociologist that has actually been so successful in engaging the broader publics around fundamental issues of our time. Okay. Now, Gramsci has the three parallel pillars. Gramsci, too, is interested in a form of cultural domination that he calls hegemony, which is the parallel to symbolic domination. He, too, is interested in the question of reflexivity, of how it is that we know the world. He has a theory of intellectuals, which corresponds in some ways to, as we'll see, to Bourdieu's theory of reflexivity. And third, Gramsci too was engaged in the world, and he had a lot to say about his engagement with the world, what he calls the philosophy of praxis. So there are these parallelisms, and parallelisms enable us to actually make the comparison. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Marx. I'm going to give you a potted Marx, and I'm happy to argue that some people argue that Marx said it all, and Marxists indeed have nothing to say afterwards. That the truth always lies in Marx. I take a very different view. Let me be blunt about this. That basically Marxism actually has been built on the shoulders of Marx. That actually one can talk about the Marxist tree, which has many branches, has an emerging trunk, and that actually sort of reflects the contradictions and anomalies that appear in different countries at different times, posed by different historical challenges. So it is an evolving tradition. So I'm going to start with Marx, a simple Marx, And then I'm going to present Bourdieu's critique of Marx, or at least my understanding of Bourdieu's critique of Marx. Then I'm going to present Gramsci's critique of Marx, showing how parallel and on the one hand and how different they are. And then I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to do something that I hope you will help me develop, namely how Bourdieu and Gramsci would deal with Trumpism. All right, let's go. And I've got 35 minutes. Okie dokie. Let's see what happens.
You can do it.
I can do it. Martin will help me. All right. Here's Marx. This is the traditional mode of production. This is my rendition of Marx's summary of his own work, written in the preface of the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in about 1857. So there he writes, he has a two-part vision now, in my view. There, a dynamic and a static one. And the dynamic one goes as follows. After the traditional mode of production, there follows the ancient mode of production. After the ancient mode, we have feudal mode of production. Now we have capitalism. Now, capitalism is really the only mode of production he ever theorizes, and basically this whole story is probably more a product of his imagination than of theory, but he does have a very interesting, elaborate view of capitalism. Capitalism for Marx and Engels, as you know, sows the seeds of its own destruction by generating crises of profit and crises of overproduction. And so the dynamics of capitalism sows the seeds of its own production at the same time as it generates intensification of class struggle. Yes, and so the convergence of the deepening of crisis and the intensification of class struggle leads to disappearance of capitalism and the rise of communism. Isn't that good, David? Now we have to, that's the dynamic picture. That's the dynamic picture, but the actual story we want to tell of capitalism is this developing class struggle, which is one of the problematic features of his analysis of capitalism. There we have the bourgeoisie and the working class. And what Marx argues, and this is very important, that the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the working class is one of exploitation, in which surplus labor is appropriated from the direct producers, but that surplus labor is actually invisible, and so Marx and Engels, Marx have views of actually the ways in which production itself mystifies what's going on. And also we know about, so for example, commodity fetishism, which is another claim in Marx, and the way that markets mystify production. So what Marx and Engels are arguing is that there is an embedded in the very relations of production, a process of mystification, which something that Bourdieu will call misrecognition. So there is a pre-reflexive form of knowledge that is a product of the relations into which men and women enter as they transform nature. So, but Marx and Engels are actually saying that there is also not only the mystification inherent to the relations, there's also a dominant ideology, and these are the superstructures he talks about. I think he talks about the legal, philosophical, religious. There's one other. And he branches them all together and talks about them as ideology. And basically this ideology, these superstructures, provide a terrain on which class struggle occurs. And basically the dominant ideology will actually have an impact upon the working class. What that impact exactly is not always clear, but nevertheless there is definitively an impact. So that's the superstructure, the dominant ideology thesis. Yes. And then Marx, and this is the optimistic moment, says that basically through struggles developing, the mystification and the dominant ideology will both be dissolved, and class struggle will intensify, and the working class will come to realize their opposition to capital, and eventually, of course, seize power and botch your own communism. Yes. The problem with this is indeed that mystification is quite deep and dominant ideology is quite powerful. And I believe Marx and Engels underestimated both. Enter Bourdieu and Gramsci. So, that's the story, that's the picture. The dynamic picture, and then there is the static picture, which is about the potential reproduction of capitalism, which in the end, actually Marx and Engels say, will not be sufficient to actually prevent the working class engaging in transformative struggle. All right. Bourdieu. Bourdieu actually, in my view, develops this picture, the idea of the superstructures. Basically, I would argue that Bourdieu has a whole set of superstructures and develops what's in these black triangles. He does lots of other things too, but that's a major way in which he actually moves beyond Marx. And he will have an idea, notions of mystification, which is a deep, embodied knowledge, practical knowledge that is unclear to the participants, and they will also talk about a dominant ideology. So not that far in some ways from Marx himself, only coming to very different conclusions. Alright, now that's a summary of 600 pages of distinction. Basically what he says is there are three classes. I don't know where he gets these three classes from, but they're there. Clearly from Marx, it seems to me. A dominant class, a petty bourgeoisie, and a working class. And basically what he says in the book, in my view, is that people participate in all sorts of practices of consumption. They go to particular movies, they listen to certain types of music, they eat certain food, and these consumption practices are in a hierarchy which is homologous to the class hierarchy, and at the same time obscures that class hierarchy. So people get absorbed in these consumptive practices and in the hierarchy of consumptive practices, and that actually obscures their class origins. That blue thing, oh, it's not working. The blue, this is reference to the idea in Bourdieu that the dominant class and the petty bourgeoisie can be seen in terms of the combination of economic and cultural capital, which are in some sort of chiastic relationship. The more economic capital you have, the less cultural capital. So he looks at class as a combination of the two. But what I want to stress is that this consumptive practices are both simultaneously obscure and secure the reproduction of class. Then, of course, he moves on to all these analyses of different fields, and all this magnificent book on education. Rules of Art is another magnificent book on the field of literature and its origins. He has a lot to say about politics as a field. And then it's disappointing, this one here. I was waiting for many years, because I don't read French, and actually to read Bourdieu in French would be more of a nightmare than I can bear to even think about. It's a great thing about having translations is that the translator has actually had to figure out what Bourdieu is saying, and therefore it's often simpler than the original French. But what I was waiting for this analysis of the economy, since he had said so often that these fields were threatened by the expansion of the economy, and actually when he writes about the economy, it turns out the social structure of the economy is really about one sector of the economy around housing. There is no theory of the economy, but we do hear time and again of how the economy dominates and subverts the autonomy of these fields. So that is definitely part and parcel of the framework within which he operates. But he has no real analysis of the relationship amongst these fields. I don't believe he does. He's very concerned about relations within fields, but not between fields or among fields, except insofar as they are connected. The elites of these fields are connected through the field of power, he calls it. And in the field of power, the agents that are dominant in the field engage in a struggle among themselves and use the resources that they bring to that field to try and advance their interests in the field of power. So politics is focused on this field of power, something like C. Wright Mills' power elite. But then, of course, there's also something else. Well, it's not come yet. There's a trouble with PowerPoint. is it doesn't always follow the logic of my mind. But anyway, here the idea is that these fields actually, and particularly true of education, constitute the misrecognition of class relations in much the same way as the distinction book that focuses on consumption confuses, misrecognizes class. So the reproduction of class relations through education is one that actually mystifies the way it operates. That is to say, for education, people participate in education. Their participation is secured through the possibility of actually gaining access to labor markets, but at the same time, what is obscured is the class relations that are being reproduced. The school appears autonomous, but at the same time is valorizing the cultural capital of the middle or upper classes. And in valorizing those classes actually are at an advantage to proceed through schools. But it appears as though they are just simply gifted. And you can make the same sort of arguments about these other fields, that they generate a misrecognition of what is going on. And what Bourdieu argues is that this misrecognition is represented through the concept of habitus, which is the internalization of the logic of fields, and that this misrecognition is largely unconscious. It is not. You can't recover that recognition of class because it is so deeply embodied and embedded. And so what he says essentially is the dominated classes suffer from misrecognition and therefore cannot see the conditions of their own subjugation. He spends a lot of time talking about the problems of Marxists and feminists who talk about consciousness. He says the problem with false consciousness is not the falseness, but actually the idea that consciousness is the critical issue. Consciousness is something very superficial, but really what we need to understand is that falseness is very deeply embodied in the habitus, and is not easily changed. He says it's changed only through, at one point he mentions this in Pascalian Meditations, through a process of counter-training, which involves a sort of martial counter-training of the body. So the habitus is indeed embedded and embodied. The body itself is what he sometimes calls a memory pad, an unconscious memory pad. It is not, you cannot recover from it some inner truth. We cannot have access to it. I'm going on about this because that is crucial to the Bourdieusian framework, that the dominated classes, and indeed to the dominant classes, but particularly the dominated classes, suffer from bad sense, that they cannot see the conditions of their own subjugation. Ooh, it's hot in here. Okay, but I mustn't forget the state. Yes, well, I see Mara's here, so I must never forget the state. The state has supposedly the monopoly of legitimate symbolic power. It is in some sort of a negotiated relationship with the field of power to determine what categories, classifications should be current in society. And it also seems to stimulate and promote the bad sense in the dominated classes. Hence my beautiful arrows. All right. Let's see what's next. Yes. So how does one get out of this? If the dominated classes cannot see the conditions of their own subjugation, then we must return to the intellectuals. Only the intellectuals can see the world. But it turns out, not all intellectuals. Most intellectuals, most academics, suffer from scholastic fallacies because they don't consider the conditions of their own production of knowledge. However, sociologists, they're special because they actually examine the conditions of the production of knowledge. And it's not all sociologists, by the way. It is usually the crowd of people around Pierre Bourdieu. I shouldn't be making jokes at his expense. No. All right. Yes, all right. Intellectual. So that's one way out. One way. So he turns, having actually examined the conditions of existence of the subjugated classes, he sees it's a hopeless project for them to engage in struggle and therefore turns to intellectuals. The other strategy is actually similar to that, is to work actually with the logic of the state. He says this again in Pascalian Meditations, which to my mind is the locus of his final culminating theorization, following on from the logic of practice and outline of the theory of practice. And he argues here that essentially the state is essentially a universalistic entity that has, for all its problems, for all the ways in which it is hijacked, nonetheless, at essence, the state promotes the universal, basically universal access to the conditions of universality. It is actually concerned with the general interest. That is the logic of the state. So he's talking about the law, he's talking about sometimes bureaucracies, that if one operates according to their logic, then actually all will be good and the state will actually promote the general interest. So it sounds very Hegelian. So in the end, having abandoned the dominated classes, he turns to intellectuals and the logic of the state as the way forward. That is what he calls the Realpolitik of Reason. That the politics of reason should engage with the state on its own terrain, on its own logic. The law itself contains within it the logic of universality. Cool. All right, that's it. I noticed that off the side the classes have disappeared. Well, they actually do disappear in basically his analysis of the potentialities of progressive change. Except, of course, all this is really happening largely in the dominant class. All right, that is Bourdieu. Gramsci. Gramsci, we start out with a form of cultural domination called hegemony, combination of force and consent, in which the application of force itself is the object of consent. That is the abstract idea, the idea that there are two types of domination, despotic or dictatorial domination, which is arbitrary application of force, and then the hegemonic form of domination, which is this combination of force and consent, which Gramsci argued is characteristic of advanced capitalism. It was an enormous, might say even revolutionary breakthrough within Marxism, his theorization of hegemony, which goes, in my view, as follows. There's the economic base. Here are the superstructures. This is straight from the preface to a contribution to critique of political economy. And then in the middle, something that Marx never talks about, civil society. Well, he talks about civil society, but not in terms of the organizations, institutions, and social movements that are neither part of the state nor the economic base. And this civil society has all sorts of invisible threads that connect it to the state, and for Gramsci, the state itself has an expanded character, far more expanded than Marx and Engels anticipated, including, of course, all sorts of what they call ideological state apparatuses, education, law, welfare, all sorts of regimes that actually go beyond Marx and Engels' vision of the state. And the state, in a sense, sets limits on and shapes the seemingly autonomous civil society. And this is the crucial point. The introduction of the idea of civil society with advanced capitalism means that struggle is actually absorbed in civil society. This is a vehicle for organizing consent. So yes, force and consent, you might say, are combined now in the state, and they're also combined in civil society. Even a workplace has the element of force in the sense that workers can be fired. But the point is that force is the sort of the armor of consent. It is the external perimeters of consent. And so this is a whole new vision of the way in which struggles against capitalism are absorbed by civil society. So, that's it, state and civil society. Now there are classes here, and he doesn't have a lot to say about classes, but he says that basically the classes that are formed on the economic base, when you want to think about struggles in civil society, you have to think about those classes, and he says you can measure their strength in so objective terms. But he also says that hegemony has a material basis in which the dominant classes make concessions to the dominated. Class compromise is very crucial. Again, none of the Marxists until this time had really centered the idea of class compromise as the foundation of this new form of domination hegemony. And then he says these classes are wheeled in to the civil society, and that is where they engage in struggle. And now what happens? We have a struggle for hegemony. Now this is going to be a little bit of a complicated picture, but it's not too difficult. There's a struggle from above and from below. First of all, let's put the dominant class in there. It's a class that operates backstage because it has these traditional intellectuals to represent universality. The wonderful thing about traditional intellectuals is their apparent autonomy, both from the dominant class and indeed from the state. They are able to present the interests of the dominant class as the interests of all. Yes, that is called the hegemonic ideology, which actually percolates through and absorbs and shapes the terrain of struggle on civil society. As Marx had said, so ideology is a terrain upon which struggle takes place. Social justice is a terrain upon which struggles take place. Making America great again is a terrain upon which struggles can be entered. Yes, but how do you engage in that struggle? Gramsci says because consent is so effective through the organization of civil society, it needs a sort of counter civil society, the modern prince or the organic intellectual. This is his vision of the Communist Party that will engage in organizing civil society within its own rubric, within its own terrain, and at the same time engaging with the working class. Now here is a big difference from Bourdieu, because and this is really crucial, for Gramsci, the working class, subordinated classes, are immersed in common sense. But at the kernel of the common sense, the pre-reflexive kernel of the common sense is good sense. What he's arguing is that when men and women collectively enter into the transformation of nature, they can then actually understand the world. Bourdieu does not think that way at all. The dominated cannot understand the way the world works, and we'll see why. Because actually the dominated classes are not only subject to a habitus that is actually internalizes the dominant classifications, but it does not have access to what he calls Schole, which is the leisured existence that enable intellectuals to pursue their science. The dominated classes cannot understand their subjugation. They do not have good sense, they have bad sense. So where Gramsci argues that it is actually in the collective transformation of nature that workers can actually understand the world, understand exploitation, potentially at any rate, Bourdieu denies that. But of course, the good sense is embedded in the common sense, and the common sense itself is contaminated by the dominant ideologies. But at the core is the good sense. And it is the modern prince should elaborate the good sense and, in a sense, in that way, advance class struggle, which for him has two parts. One is a war of position, which is the reconstitution of civil society under the control of the modern prince, a long, laborious, and seemingly almost impossible task. But once that war of position is won, the war of movements is basically seizing state power is but an easy aftermath after the struggle for a war of position. Yeah. Now, any more on that? I mean, that's it. I'm doing great. Okay, this is my summary. 2 pictures. So, Bourdieu imposing symbolic domination, Gramsci's struggle for hegemony. Now I'm going to draw about 5 or 6 points from this comparison. 1. For Bourdieu, symbolic domination. For Gramsci, hegemony are the 2 forms of cultural domination. Hegemony, understood as the combination of force and consent, organized through civil society. Symbolic domination, working through bodily knowledge that is unconscious and inaccessible to seemingly all but a few sociologists. Then, for Bourdieu, it is the relationship between the state and the field of power is where the action is, where the politics is. Whereas for Gramsci, it is the relationship between state and civil society. Bourdieu, amazingly, I mean, he's written quite a lot. Amazingly, I cannot find, except in his very last writings where he starts talking about social movements, never ever talks about civil society. So I think the equivalent concept is the field of power. That's where action really takes place. Now, for Bourdieu, the pre-reflexive knowledge is far more important for most people than the reflexive knowledge. So it is the bodily knowledge that is actually the powerful knowledge, and it's not altogether clear exactly how that logic of practice in which we are embedded, all of us embedded except for a few intellectuals, and they too, which is a big issue, they too are embedded in practical knowledge, and it's not clear how they can transcend that practical knowledge and develop an understanding of science of society. But essentially what he's arguing is that the pre-reflexive knowledge, the logic of practice, is actually much more powerful than the reflexive knowledge and much more prevalent than the reflexive knowledge, whereas Gramsci is the opposite. Gramsci pays a lot of attention to the ideas of consciousness. That is the reflexive knowledge, deliberate action, deliberate organization. Consent is a rational comprehension of the nature of domination. Reflexive is much more important than the pre-reflexive. There is pre-reflexive knowledge in Gramsci, but it refers to the ways in which the common sense is actually contains a good sense. So the pre-reflexive is the positive moment in Gramsci, whereas the pre-reflexive is the negative moment in Bourdieu. That says to say that for Bourdieu, the dominated are dominated by their bad sense, whereas for Gramsci there is always this underlying good sense of the dominated, that they can, by virtue of their subjugation, by virtue of their collective transformation of nature, understand the world. And then we have these ideas of traditional organic intellectuals. Well, Bourdieu is essentially, in Gramscian terms, a traditional intellectual who advocates, defends the autonomy of intellectuals, and in defending the autonomy of intellectuals is indeed able to present the interests of intellectuals as the interests of all. He talks about, Bourdieu talks about his intellectuals, the autonomous intellectuals, as a corporatism of the universal, that their intellectuals have a particular interest in pursuing the universal and pursuing the general. So he has a very optimistic view of intellectuals. Gramsci, in calling them traditional intellectuals, is is saying that in fact they are most effective in reproducing capitalism by virtue of their claim to autonomy and their claims to universality. Whereas Gramsci, of course, is going to favour organic intellectuals that are closely connected, in this case, to the working class. They're in dialogue with the working class. Yes. But of course, Bourdieu is very sceptical of the very idea of organic intellectuals because there is no good sense in the subordinate classes. There's nothing to elaborate, and they can only be deceiving themselves, and so he talks about the mythology of the organic intellectual. I mean, it's interesting, by the way, that Bourdieu rarely refers to Gramsci at all, and when he does, it's usually to appropriate his ideas for a defense of his own position, like the critique that Gramsci makes of political parties and trade unions. Bourdieu will appropriate that idea, but he never engages with the central ideas of Gramsci. And Gramsci, of course, doesn't deal with Bourdieu, except through my voice here. Yes. So anyway, so there is the endorsement of the organic intellectuals here and traditional intellectuals there, and then for Bourdieu, the intellectuals are engaged in, yes, a classification struggle. That is a struggle over the very terms that we use in actually defining the world in which we live. Terms that we, for the most part, take for granted. And this classification struggle takes place in the field of power, and to some extent possibly in the other separate fields that I've indicated there. Whereas Gramsci, ultimately recognizing that struggle takes place on the terrain of a hegemonic ideology, nonetheless is ultimately interested in class struggle. I don't think we ever get from classification struggle to class struggle in Bourdieu. Well, I haven't seen it, if it's there. Yeah. All right, and finally, of course, no, I've seen this word, of course, too often. Sorry. And finally, Bourdieu never uses, well, only rhetorically, uses the word capitalism. He's talking about modernity, though he never uses that word really. But he has no theory on the end of capitalism, no theory of the capitalist economy. He is very much a Durkheimian in this regard and talks about modernity, whereas, of course, for Gramsci, hegemony is a capitalist, as a concept refers to capitalism. And of course the symbolic domination for Gramsci, for Bourdieu is ubiquitous. And of course one of the ways in which one I think has to engage Bourdieu is to say, well, perhaps in some societies it's more powerful than in others, or in some societies it takes one form and in other societies it takes a different form. And in my own work I studied Eastern Europe, well, state socialism in Eastern Europe as it was. And there I think symbolic domination doesn't function of the same way as it does, for example, in France. We've got to understand the limits of this symbolic domination. That is a critique of Bourdieu on his own terms. And there are lots of critiques of Gramsci on his own terms, but I won't tell you those. Okay. So there we are. So I've got 4 minutes left to tell you about Trumpism. Now this is very experimental. So anyway, I just thought I would invoke, some of you may know that last semester Mara put on a series of fascinating colloquia about, well, it wasn't last semester, it was the semester before last. God, time goes quite quickly. It was spring, after the election, that every week some faculty person would talk about how they see Trumpism. So I just want to refer to a few of those and divide them up into Bourdieusians and Gramscians. I think I'm on safe grounds because I don't see any of the culprits here. Okay. So, Trumpism. Gramsci Bourdieu. Well, this is Dylan Riley. Crisis of hegemony, he says. This is what has happened emerging over the last 30, 40 years. There is a crisis of hegemony, organic crisis, that is thrown capitalism into somersaults, and the result of such a crisis of hegemony is the rise of a charismatic leader, Trump, who is likened to the 18th Brumaire. He's likened to a new Brumaire, and Brumaire, 18th Napoleon, the third, he emerges when there is also a crisis in 1851 within the dominant classes, and out comes this charismatic leader. Well, not so charismatic in the case of Napoleon III, and of course one could argue that Trump is not that charismatic. But anyway, the point is, that's the analogy that Dylan draws on. That it's a very Gramscian analysis of the development of crisis of hegemony, in part because the material conditions of hegemony no longer exist. There are no concessions given by the dominant class to the dominated. It's the other way around. The dominated are giving concessions to the dominant, and there's increased polarization. This, he argues, is a manifestation of the crisis of hegemony, which is also manifested by the ways in which the political parties have lost their credibility, and so there is they have been discredited, and so that is the way in which leaders can now go directly over the political system to the population. An organizational vacuum, and Chihan Tual says basically, it's a very interesting argument he makes. He says basically the left has made huge mistakes following the 1960s. It has not really managed to organize itself through something like a modern prince, if you will, though he wouldn't use that word probably, he's far too subtle. But essentially what he argues is that the left has moved in a sort of anarchistic, autonomistic, or liberal way, but not in a sort of organised way of the working classes. In fact, the organisation has been left to the right, and at that time he was talking about Bannon and his interest in Leninism. Basically, he was talking about a Leninism of the right. So, in fact, the right has managed to capture and recognise the importance of organisation. And indeed, Bannon spends a lot of time studying Lenin. And I thought that I've just been reading an MA by Tyler Leeds, who is somewhere here. Where are you, Tyler? Somewhere here. There you are. Yes. And of course, he decided there was a Bourdieusian view of the world. I decided it's a Gramscian view. Basically, he's gone and studied the state of Jefferson. It's a Tea Party movement in Northern California, Southern Oregon, and there shows how, in fact, there's the logic of their organization vis-a-vis the federal state, the state and the local state, actually shows a sort of an interesting vision of an alternative view of the world that has its own rationality, in a sense a response to the hegemonic ideology. Now Bourdieu, well, there is Ali Hochschild's work, right, that in fact the idea here is that for many of Bourdieu's notions of social change come from a conflict between the habitus, the inculcation of social structures, the conflict between the habitus and the field or the social structure itself, the conflict between the position that we hold in the field and the disposition we have, the expectation, they're often talking about education, in which there is, in which educational credentials become more and more devalued, and the expectations of students are maintained at the same level. And so that tension between the expectations and the opportunities, that sort of tension is how he sees social change, how he sees actually the ways in which people sometimes become confused, sometimes become actually quite reflective about their position. And that's a sort of similar analysis that Ali makes for the people in Louisiana who feel that their position in the queue, people are jumping ahead of them in the queue, namely minorities are jumping ahead of them in the queue, and they are, in a sense, their expectations of their future are being falsified, and so they have a sense of resentment. And it's a Bourdieusian explanation. It's not, and her point of her book is really that it's not altogether rational what they are doing, and that, of course, fits very well with the Bourdieusian idea of bad sense. And since Rocker's not here, this was Rocker's interesting account, Rocker Ray's interesting account. I don't know if she would agree to be a Bourdieusian rather than a Gramscian, but anyway, she's not here to argue with me. So she argues that right-wing populism has played upon three features: a class feature, the deserving and undeserving poor, a race ethnicity issue, anti-immigrant nativism, and the restoring, well, the project of restoring male breadwinners. This is the Trump populism that actually, in a sense, has reached over the political system and has successfully mobilized the fractions of the dominated class, particularly white men, obviously not only that. I think that's a Bourdieusian one. When I only was doing this, I only did this on a sort of more on a spur of the moment because I thought people would not like all this theory. But I'm not so sure how clear the distinction is between a Gramscian and Bourdieusian one. Essentially, of course, the essence of the distinction should be that for Gramsci there is struggle on the terrain of civil society, and it's struggle by a working class, an organized working class that is quite aware of its conditions of domination, of being dominated, whereas for Bourdieu the struggle is operating at the higher political level, and the dominated are in a sense easily victim to mobilization from above. They do not see through their own domination, though of course this whole idea of resentment assumes that they do have a sense of their alienation, which in Bourdieusian terms is this tension between the habitus and the field. Anyway, I'll leave that up there. And I'll end. Only 4 minutes late.
Please listen to the format. So we've had difficulty before with people feeling like they've been left out in the queue. I take the cue, so please raise your hand. I'll do the best I can do in order, and then Michael will just answer the question. So please have your hands raised and continue to have them raised, and I'll put you in the order in which I see them.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Okay. So, do you think that hegemony and Gramsci is just the same as like the orientation of the field in Bourdieu? That this is like the idea of what constitutes the, essentially, yeah, how the axes of capital are oriented?
Well, let me answer that, and you can tell me whether I'm answering the right question.
Okay.
But yes, within fields, you see the operation, what Gramsci would call hegemony. That there is a dominant group and a subordinate group, and they engage in a struggle with one another around the rules, and sometimes a transformation of the rules of the field. And it does look like a very conscious engagement in struggle, and therefore looks quite Gramscian within fields. So, and I suppose the most elaborate formulation of this is in the Rules of Art, where he talks about struggles within the field of literature. But yes, I think so. And he sees and also in the field of science, he sees the dominated as actually engaging in subversive strategies. He gives them a lot of rationality, which he does not give to the dominated classes in social space. Yes.
Yes. Before you do it, people, if you get an idea while he's answering, please raise your hand during that time too. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. That was a really great little condensation. I want to encourage you to continue with the PowerPoint. Great job.
Thank you, Vitaly.
Quite gifted.
So it seems like you're asking a lot from Bourdieu, so I'm going to try to defend him a little bit. You asked for a theory of classes, but maybe all he does is look at people's lifestyles and how they classify things and see and inductively kind of put them in groups. You wanted a logic of capitalism. He doesn't really give you a logic of capitalism. You wanted to figure out who and how people can get like outside of practical sense and have some kind of transcendental knowledge of their real situation, their real situation of domination. But I mean, did you ever consider that maybe there are no real fundamental classes, that there is no transcendental position to talk about, to look at your domination, that maybe there isn't any there is no revolution that will free us from the basic logic of domination, because there is no single one logic of domination? I mean, is it possible that Bourdieu's basic framework is that society is based on relations of power, forms of recognition and misrecognition, that all we have is practical sense and all we can do is see the world from our particular position, and whatever tools we might muster to resist and undermine domination, some other relations of power will then take its place and we'll still be analyzing society in the same way?
Yeah, very good. That sounds like a Foucauldian orientation to
No, it's not that far.
Yeah. No, but I just don't think that is. Bourdieu is a real Enlightenment thinker, real believer in science, and so you start out by saying very interestingly, basically a very good summary of many of the points I made. So thank you very much for re-summarizing them. But yes, no real classes. So what's fascinating about distinction is he starts with these three classes, and he ends with classification struggle, in which actually class is not given. There's a real paradox. So it looks as though on the one hand he wants to have the objective classes, and he actually presents them as such, but by the end of the book he's only got one chapter, but it's one chapter on classification struggle, in which classes are the effect of classification struggles. There's a real tension, and I think that tension is worth working with, and you can run with it in two directions. One is to the more relativist position which you're advocating, and the other is to the more objectivist one. I think that ultimately Bourdieu wants to go to the objectivist one. He wants to be able to engage in science. And so yes, I think so. Yes, again, you're right. one could argue that Bourdieu, he gives enormous importance to practical knowledge. But I think he can only do that because he's got a theory of it which makes him a scientist. So you have to have a sort of a reflexive knowledge to even recognize the pre-reflexive practical knowledge. So implicit in his argument is an alternative knowledge to practical knowledge. It's the whole point of his opus is to say you can still have a science. And then the puzzle is, how do you figure that out? How does one have a science? That's the fascinating question. And I think, this is just a footnote to that, I think there's a lot of work to be done by Bourdieusians. Rather than repeat the master, as was done often by Marxologists, to actually recognize these contradictions. As I always say, a great theorist is to be recognized by great contradictions. And I think there are really great contradictions in Bourdieu. And we have to wrestle with them, not to sort of position ourselves in one extreme and in that way sort of resolve them in a sort of interesting but too easy a fashion, if I may say so, Fitawi.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, coming to this final slide, I still wasn't quite sure where in either of these two positions, or indeed in your own, there's a kind of economic basis or a kind of economic contradiction lying behind support for Trump. I mean, there's an awful lot been written about the fact that economic stratification and other forms aren't really a good indicator for support for him. Education maybe a little bit, but even there's not much in it. So I wonder how you see that, whether there are any economic
well, I mean, the first one, the crisis of hegemony, is all about the way that the economy has generated such polarization that the material base of hegemony have eroded. That's the claim that Dylan makes. I'm not convinced that there is a hegemonic crisis. And I don't know what my own account of Trumpism would be. I was, they all seem to have some payoff, and I think that's and the question for me is whether what insights these two theorists may have on this, and if they don't have any, then I think we have to abandon these theories. So I think it's important for us to figure that out. That's why I put it at the end, but I haven't quite figured it out. But no, the economy really, and of course the economy comes into this sort of the right-wing populism and the idea of the restoring. It is, of course, an economic disenfranchisement that many of the supporters of Trump have experienced. And so that is for Bourdieu, this tension between expectations and actual opportunities. So I think that people are implicitly often using a Bourdieusian framework.
Yes, sir.
Is Trump a potential fascist?
Is Trump a potential fascist? Well, actually, Dylan actually addresses that question. And he says, no, this is not fascism. Fascism has a party. And so, yes, I don't know about Trump himself, but fascism is definitely, it's to my mind not on the agenda at this point. Perhaps I'm just being optimistic. But no, fascism as we know it has always had a sort of a political party behind it, and there's no political party at this point behind Trump, unless you think the Republicans are becoming such a party. Well, that I'll leave for open discussion.
Any other questions? He really has summed it up that well. Well, just think it's probably the PowerPoint.
Yes.
Well,
all power, no points.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, please join me in thanking my everybody's